unlocking your world of creativity with best-selling author and brand innovator, Mark Stinson. This episode is brought to you by White Cloud Coffee Roasters, where every bean tells a story of adventure. Visit whitecloudcoffee.com and use the code CREATIVITY.
Welcome back, friends, to our podcast, Your World of Creativity. We love traveling around the globe, talking to creative practitioners everywhere about how they get inspired and how we organize the ideas, and most of all, how we gain the confidence and the connections to launch our work out into the world. And today we've got a very personal episode talking about how grief, loss, and connection can actually deepen our creative and leadership capacity. And my guest is Ian Ziskin. Ian, welcome to the show.
Mark, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and actually I should say welcome back, because Ian first joined me on Your World of Creativity back in 2022. First of all, I can't believe it's been that long. But you had another collaborative anthology then with some diverse voices about leadership. And now this book, entitled Lives Lost and Leadership Found, is really, it's a nice combination. I was reading of neuroscience, but also very deeply personal essays about people's special somebodies and how they were teachers. Tell us how this book came about and how you applied some of your HR experience, your leadership experience into writing. And since it's an anthology, gathering the stories about grief and loss.
The origin of the book is actually quite personal. So going back to 2023, both my brother and then my mother passed away about 6 months apart. My brother's case, he was 4.5 years younger than me, quite unexpected at the age of 60, diagnosed with metastatic cancer. And from diagnosis to death was 8 days. So it went very fast. And then in my mother's case, she was 93. So it would be hard to say that a 93-year-old passing away would be unexpected. But I'm fond of saying that she was fine right up until the time she wasn't. It was one of these circumstances where she experienced some severe stomach pains, ended up going to the hospital literally within 5 hours, had passed away from cardiac arrest as her body just shut down from all the stress that she was experiencing. And both of these deaths in fairly rapid succession, somewhat unexpected. Of course, that rocks you back just in terms of the typical experience with grief or loss, but it also got me thinking about what did I learn from them about certain life lessons. As somebody who's always studied and spent a lot of time working in the leadership space, I was also thinking about not only life lessons, but also leadership lessons, which then pretty quickly got me to a point of thinking, of course, I'm not the only person on the planet who's experienced loss. I wonder if others in my network and community who've been through similar experiences also might have thought about life or leadership lessons learned from somebody that they lost. So after reaching out to a number of colleagues to see if there would be interest in contributing something that might ultimately turn out to be a book, one of the things I learned pretty quickly was that there was a ton of interest and a lot of common experiences that people had, but really had not shared in any concrete way. So hence from there came the idea for the book, Lives Lost and Leadership Found. And anything that we're going to be talking about over the course of our conversation, I just want to make sure that you and your listeners know this is not just Ian's view of the universe. It's really a compilation of voices, several hundred voices, in fact, of different contributors to essays and survey feedback, and even representing the voices of the people who've passed away, because they taught us the lessons that are shared in this book.
So powerful. And you're reminding me, as you tell your own sort of personal and emotional story, that we're reminded that we never know what people are going through. And that can be an HR lesson for sure, but just societal, emotional intelligence in general. We just never know what our friends, our colleagues, just people we might meet in a coffee shop, what they're going through. And until we put those stories out, Yeah.
As an HR professional, as somebody who's been around the topic of leadership for a long time, that's actually one of the most powerful takeaways for me from the book, because I'm obviously a believer. If you write a book, hopefully you're sharing some knowledge or information with people that they find useful. But I also think you should learn something as you're writing a book. And one of the most powerful things that I learned was this whole idea of what people are carrying around with them, in some cases for a very long time, that unless you create some type of forum or platform for people to actually be able to express it, you might never know what they're carrying around. So the whole idea of listening and empathy and understanding the baggage that people bring with them wherever they go, quite oftentimes hidden below the surface, but it still has a huge impact on how people think and operate and behave and the way they conduct themselves. That was actually a very big aha moment for me, even though I try to be an empathetic person and somebody who listens well. I don't think you can ever fully appreciate what those around you are dealing with. And it's a very important reminder, I think, for all of us.
And I think some people might say that's just good human relations to have some empathy for your fellow man. But you really uncovered some neuroscience connections of how this might even rewire our leadership through the experiences of loss. What did you discover in that regard?
Yeah, this turned out to be an important foundation for the book. I would not consider myself to be an expert on neuroscience by any means, but as part of putting the book together, I wanted to try to understand some of the underlying neuroscience behind why and how we behave as we do in the face of loss and the whole grieving process. And here's a few things that I learned. Impact on the body and the brain, as well as impact on leadership, is fairly substantial. For example, if you think about the physiological and brain-related aspects of dealing with loss, things like blood pressure and heart rate and cortisol levels, an impact on memory and brain fog, and to the point that you raised, Mark, that there's actually science that would suggest that because people who are important to us are coded into our brains, when they pass away, it has a huge impact on our brain, and the brain begins to actually rewire itself to better cope with the reality that, on the one hand, this person is and has been so important to us, and on the other hand, they're gone and no longer with us. And that's actually part of the grieving process, is the rewiring of the brain. The connection also on the neuroscience aspect to leadership, which I found also quite fascinating. David Rock and Jeffrey Schwartz, who are well-known leaders in the neuro leadership space, they talk about this whole idea that you gain a certain amount of pain from change and a certain amount of power from focus. And oftentimes we talk about change in the context of the business environment, like leading change in an organization.
Yes.
And those of us who've been through that, either the perpetrators of change or the victims of change, know that it can be painful. But in the context of losing a loved one, somebody who's really important to us, that also generates pain, not just figuratively, but literally. And the better one's ability to focus and work your way through in a somewhat intentional way the experience of loss and processing the loss, that actually brings us a certain amount of power and the ability to deal with the difficult aspects of loss, all of which connects back to this foundational element of neuroscience that helps explain the way people behave and why they behave as they go through a significant loss of a special somebody, as we call it in the book.
Yes. These neuroscience, these sort of stressors, and you mentioned rewiring, it's just so fascinating to learn. I wanted to turn the page a little bit and talk about your creative process. Yeah, when we first met more than a couple of years ago, we were talking about the first anthology you co-created, and that was very much on this leadership topic. But now another collaboration. Certainly this process seems to work for you. What lessons learned did you carry forward into this new project from this first collaborative process?
I think probably the single most important lesson was acknowledging I'm not smart enough to think of all these things on my
Yeah, let's
and
get some
thinking
other
it's
ideas. Yeah.
yeah, just recognizing the value of the community, collaborative effort with smart people who I respect and enjoy working with and being around. All are going to have better ideas or at least different ideas than I do about some of these things. So the collaborative effort, the community related aspects of this in my previous book and now in this book really became a foundational underpinning for the way I think about trying to write a book, even though it can be a giant cat herding exercise to bring all of these different perspectives into an integrated whole. That's part of the challenge and the enjoyment of it. But I think you end up with a better product because you've got a broader set of points of view, in this case, about life and lessons learned from losing people who are very important to us. And each story or each input that people contributed to the book had a different fact set and a different person that was being honored and focused on in the story. But it became somewhat amazing in a way that so many common themes began to emerge. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to utilize this collaborative process. It was the belief that those kinds of themes would emerge, but so many other things until you actually write the book and until you invite other people to contribute their stories and essays to the book, you really don't know what you're going to get until you get it.
Yeah, so true. And the many voices that come in. I was curious about your expectations versus maybe the finished product and reality. You thought there would be commonalities. You thought, I wonder if all these perspectives might be integrated into a single narrative. But did you find that along the way? How much did you have to guide? How much did you have to edit? How much did you have to give feedback? A little more of this, a little less of that? Or did you just say, hey, their stories are their stories, and I'll publish them in their voice?
The guidance process relative to the collaborative creative process is an interesting paradox, right? Because on the one hand, you want to encourage people to tell their story the way they would tell it and use whatever level of expression and creativity and emotion they can bring forth to the story. And you don't want to interfere with that too much. On the other hand, you do need to provide people with some guidance about here's generally speaking what we're trying to accomplish. Here's the kind of things that you should be talking about in telling your story. Here's roughly the number of words you should use
Sure.
in doing that. And so what part of the creative process that's always fascinating to me is some of the individuals that you work with follow pretty religiously and closely the guidance that you offer. And other people's response is, oh, I didn't realize that guidance was for me. They were thinking that I was trying to provide guidance for somebody else who wasn't them. So there was a little bit of back and forth, but fortunately not much. The quality of the 35 essays, for example, that was submitted was tremendous. The level of insight and creativity and raw emotion, but also being able to extract valuable life and leadership lessons from these essays as they were being written was also great. We did some editing. I have a program manager, a guy by the name of Matt McGovern, who does a terrific job, who's worked with me on this book, who helped with the back and forth with each of the authors to provide a little bit of guidance and some tweaking here and there where needed. But fortunately, it wasn't nearly as substantial as you might worry about when you're inviting people to contribute to a book like this. And that enabled us to really focus most of the time and energy on the creative process of what is the story, how similar or different will each story be, and what kind of patterns or themes are beginning to emerge as the stories were being submitted for the book. So back to your prior comment, Mark, I had some hypotheses about there might be some common themes. I even dared to think a little bit about what those themes might be, but I tried to be really careful not to lock down too early on what the themes would be or presuppose them, all because out of respect for the creative process and frankly, the emotional process that I thought most people might be going through. Now, the thing that I didn't anticipate at all, just to finish the answer to your question, or anticipated very poorly, I think, was all the feedback I got from the contributing authors when they were finished writing their essays about the cathartic experience that it represented to them. And you have to remember, of course, some people were writing about lost loved one who may have passed away a matter of months prior to writing their essay. Other people were contributing essays where the person important to them had passed away 10, 20, 30, 40, or 50 or more years ago, yet the level of emotion and the impact of honoring this person and the catharsis that people felt as a result of being able to write down and share their story about this person, those were almost exactly the same, irrespective of how recently or long ago the person passed away. I just didn't fully anticipate the level of catharsis and emotion that would be brought out from people as a result of contributing these stories.
Yes. And maybe they've told that story many times over the years, but really putting it in print, knowing that they're sharing it is different than maybe just telling somebody. Yeah.
Yes. And by the way, while what you just said is completely true, there are also examples of people who really never told the story. They were carrying something with them for a really long time, for whatever good or bad reasons, didn't feel comfortable sharing it with others, including their own family members. And that was part of why the catharsis for a lot of people was so strong, that they were carrying something around with them, never fully expressed, let alone written down, never even expressed verbally to people, and sharing not only their own feelings about the person, but also what this person represented to them in terms of life lessons or even leadership lessons. So I think people appreciated, probably to a degree that I just did not fully anticipate, the value and to some degree, in a strange way, joy of being able to express these feelings about somebody who was very important to them.
Yes. And I'm curious what a couple of those key lessons or themes that emerged for you might have been surprising. Like you said, you thought, of course, of this or that, but that this theme might emerge. What was it that might have surprised you?
Yeah, so I'll just give you a compare and contrast, right? So one thing that didn't necessarily surprise me, but emerged very strongly, was the recognition of the importance of courage and then resilience in dealing with things in a fearless, very determined way, overcoming obstacles and understanding what it takes to push back in certain difficult circumstances or bounce back from extremely difficult circumstances where resilience really did matter a lot. So that was a very strong theme throughout the book for a number of people. It wasn't super surprising, because you would imagine anybody who's gone through these types of difficult things might emphasize courage and resilience. One of the bigger things that popped out from the book that I picked up along the way that was a surprise was the importance and the value of intentionality. And part of the book, I talk about this concept of the tensions of intentionality. Think about it this way, that there's a social media personality, Giselle Ibarra, who talks about the fact that in order to heal, you must hurt. Life is a paradox, basically. In order to heal, you must hurt. And this came through loud and clear in the book, because there were a variety of different tensions that almost every person who would talk about a lost loved one had to work their way through. And what I started to realize as I was seeing all these stories and getting a lot of the survey feedback was there was a certain intentionality to people's approach of trying to learn from and work their way through these paradoxes or competing tensions. It didn't just happen accidentally. So I came out of this with this realization that, the old expression, time heals all wounds. I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I think that's only about half the story. I think the other half of the story is intentionality heals all wounds, not just time. You have to be intentional in your thought process of how am I going to work my way through this. I'll give you an example or two. There's probably too many of these for us to talk about now, but a couple of them that really resonated with me was one, the intentional transition from fog to clarity. So I was saying earlier that the neuroscience would tend to suggest that when you're dealing with a significant loss and grieving process that you're going through, there's a certain fog that affects us. And I know from my own personal experience, when my brother passed away and I got the call that he was going into the hospital, I jumped on an airplane to go to Atlanta, where my brother and mother were both living, from New York, where I live. And to this day, I still cannot remember anything about my drive to the airport, my time in the airport, my time on the plane. My next memory after learning of this was actually being with my mother in the hospital a number of hours later. So hopefully I wasn't driving too erratically or doing too many weird things on the plane, but I really don't remember much about it. And that's actually a very common occurrence. People will talk about fog that exists not only for a moment, but for many months. It's one of the reasons why people who are experts in grief tend to suggest don't make any big, important life decisions for at least 3 to 6 months and perhaps longer because of this fog that tends to linger with us. And then eventually you pass through to a place of more clarity. And the people who are most effective at doing that are pretty intentional about recognizing the fog and then working their way toward clarity. Another brief example is many people who pretty successfully process grief and loss have this ability to compartmentalize. And the whole process of compartmentalization, of recognizing that you're going through an extremely difficult time in one aspect of your life, yet at the same time, you might have other family responsibilities or job responsibilities or other life responsibilities that demand your attention, and trying to do this crazy balance between dealing with the stress of loss, but also being present for other things. So compartmentalization turns out to be a really important skill. And eventually you have to migrate your way back from that to integration, meaning you have to fit all of these different pieces and parts of your life that are happening simultaneously into a more integrated whole, rather than ignoring a certain aspect or compartmentalizing it and putting it in a box and trying to put it away so it doesn't overwhelm the rest of your life. So the big surprise for me, or one of the big surprises for me, was this whole aspect of the intentionality required in order to successfully work your way through these competing priorities or paradoxes.
And certainly, now that you're talking about the integration part, how to transform this loss into some sort of growth lesson or application to your life. And it's an interesting translation. Listeners, my guest is Ian Ziskin. His new book is Lives Lost and Leadership Found. And I'll put all the links to Ian, his work, and certainly where to find the book in the show notes. So look for it there. Ian, another very creative ingredient is that you actually wrote and recorded a song for the book, Here and Gone, to honor your mom, your parents, your dad, in fact, that passed earlier, and your brother. I'd love to hear the story behind the song and why you decided to incorporate it into the project.
I think maybe there's a couple of elements to it. First of all, like writing the book, I think writing the song was a bit of processing the grief for me, right? Everybody deals with their own grief in different ways. I'm probably not one to be sitting around feeling sorry for myself for very long, but the writing process does help me think through and confront my feelings. So the book was obviously an important part of that. I've written some songs and played guitar over the years. If I was any good at it, I wouldn't have had a 43-year career in HR and leadership.
Yes.
I might have
Often
been in
those two don't
leadership.
go together. Yes.
So you can say maybe I have a passion for it, which probably far exceeds my talent. But at the same time, being transparent a little bit about my own way of thinking about losing not only my brother and mother more recently, but my father over 50 years ago, and trying to acknowledge them and what they taught me in life, and also a little bit about leadership. I recorded this song. Maybe it's a little unique in the sense that most books don't include a link to a song, but this one does. So I hope anybody who picks up a copy of the book may also take a few moments to listen, not only because of the song itself, but what number of people who've listened to it have told me is that it evokes some resonance back to their own feeling about a lost loved one that they have experienced. And it causes them to start thinking about, in a different way than reading the book, what they might have learned from that person. So I suppose the music and the words in the book have two different ways of appealing to the brain as people are working their way through grief.
You were here and now you're gone. Left the world in a hurry. I'm still here but not alone. We're feeling strong, so don't worry. Here and gone. The expressions on your faces light up the edges of my mind. Imagination takes me places crystal clear, it is defined here and gone.
And oftentimes, music helps us reach that emotional part of the brain that we can't just find the rationality behind.
Yeah, I certainly, for myself personally, I do find that. So I hope others maybe get a little bit of resonance with that as well.
Yes, I'm sure. Ian, what a great conversation. Before we close, I'm curious, in the book, you also encourage us as readers, not just to maybe incorporate and integrate these stories, but you encourage us to write our own story and write our own essays, whether we contribute them to any anthology or not. But the story behind our special somebody, I like that phrase that you use throughout the book. Find that special somebody and we should write our own essay. Why do you think that's an important call to action?
You were asking me earlier about certain surprises when putting the book together, and I would say this is actually another surprise. So when starting the book, I was not anticipating at all including a section encouraging other people to write an essay. What caused me to realize that probably would be valuable was all of this feedback I was getting from our own essay contributors that I was sharing with you a few minutes ago, and the catharsis that came from that experience for them, which of course then made me realize if it was beneficial to the people who were contributing essays to the book, perhaps it would be beneficial to readers and others out there in the world who, if with a little bit of encouragement, might sit down and write their own essay to express their feelings about a special somebody to them. It could be somebody who's passed away, but perhaps it might even be somebody who's still living, who's had a huge influence on them. At the end of the book, we now include some guidelines very similar to those guidelines that I provided to the essay contributors in the book, with the strong encouragement for people to write their own essay. Now, anybody who's listening might say, I don't feel very comfortable writing something and sharing it with the entire world. And if that's the case, that's perfectly fine. You might choose to just write it for yourself and no one else, or you might choose to share it with some family members or friends who might benefit from it because perhaps they knew this person who you're honoring as your special somebody, or you might choose to share it more widely. The more important aspect is honoring the person, but also honoring yourself by being able to express some feelings and thoughts about what you might have learned from this person about life and perhaps about leadership. I think that's where the power comes from.
So good. Ian, it's been great talking to you. I love learning about the topic and the effect that it can have on our leadership, but also just the creative process and pulling it all together. And like you say, lessons learned, but also some surprises about that catharsis, about the expression of the grief and loss and how that can increase our and deepen our leadership capacity. Thanks for coming on the show again.
Thanks for the interest and the great conversation, Mark. Super to be with you.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. And check out this book, listeners, because I think you're really going to like the stories. You're really going to benefit from the stories. I can't help but think, Ian, after, as you've described, years of experience as a business executive, especially in HR, all the leadership lessons that you've seen, but how grief and loss helps build the personal connection that maybe we don't get just from work.
Always something to be learned new, including from people who you might not historically have thought about as leaders, because many of the people who are focused on in this book as the subjects of these essays probably would not have considered themselves to be leaders. And in many cases, the person writing about them, when they started writing about them, wasn't thinking about them as a leader either. So I think probably a good takeaway lesson from all of this is we're all leaders to somebody and have an influence, positive or perhaps negative, on those around us. So much better to have a positive influence.
So helpful. Listeners, come back again for our next episode. We're going to continue these around the world travels to talk to creatives about their inspiration and organization. But as we described today, how to make interesting connections and how to connect thoughts and themes and lessons learned to launch our work out into the world. And before we go, I want to thank our sponsor, White Cloud Coffee. They help us fuel these creative conversations everywhere. And listeners, you can enjoy 10% off your first order at whitecloudcoffee.com. Just use the code word creativity at checkout. And also remember to download your free ebook of your world of creativity when you visit mark-stinson.com. So until our next episode, I'm Mark Stinson, and we'll keep unlocking your world of creativity.